With 265 producers pouring some of the most coveted wines on the planet, the Wine Spectator New York experience is something that's pretty crazy, especially if you're a wine geek. There are wines being poured like Dominus, Château Montrose, Château Haut-Brion, Cheval Blanc. Last week I was able to attend both nights of the critics tasting, so it was 3 hours of tasting on a Thursday and a Friday night. I got through all 265 wines. In fact, I tasted some of my favorites multiple times just to make sure they made the cut for this video. Some things that I liked and didn't like about the experience. Number one, I think the best tastings that I've ever been to are actually James Suckling's tastings. He really knows how to put on a show. However, I did like at the Wine Spectator experience, every producer only could show one wine. Some producers were showing the current vintage, other producers were showing library wines. Some producers were showing their flagship wines, and others were showing some reserve, special, or single vineyard bottlings. It just made it easier for me as a taster to get through because it was just one producer, one wine. I could get through it. If producers were pouring multiple wines, I don't think there's any way I could have tasted all those wines over 2 days, especially with all the socializing schmoozing that I had to do.
Here we are, Clos de Vougeot Blanc.
Oh, a lot of people complain about Wine Spectator not being adventurous, showing off more mainstream wines, kind of it being all about money. And yes, the event was heavily focused on California Cab, Bordeaux, California Pinot Noir. But I'll tell you what, Wine Spectator's a business. They figured out what gets eyeballs. I know on this channel, for instance, it's frustrating when I want to show new wines, interesting wines, videos don't get a ton of views. You know what videos do get a lot of views? Anything that has Bordeaux, California Cabernet, or Pinot Noir in the title. And I get it too, with an influential publication like Wine Spectator, I'd like some more diversification. But at the end of the day, people that are spending money on wine are buying what they're buying. It just is what it is. Also, you have to deal with distribution. Some of the wines that I get excited about, like these geeky, unique varieties from the far-flung corners of the planet, only made, they're only a couple thousand bottles, so distribution is going to be really hard. Sometimes you can only get them at that point of origin. But that's what's fun about wine. You don't have to listen to Wine Spectator. You don't even have to listen to me. You have to go taste, go out and try new things. Find out what you like. Get comfortable, get confident in your palate. A lot of these wines at the show on the shelf are going to be hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. However, a couple of my favorite wines were the cheapest ones that were being poured, and I'll go over those with you. In addition to the wine experience, I was in New York for a week, tasting, meeting with different producers, different importers. I made a whole vlog about that. If you haven't seen it, I'll pin it in the top comment. I do have to thank the producer Lingua Franca from Oregon for getting me tickets to the Wine Spectator experience, so I'm not going to put their wine on the list. However, they were pouring 2021 Sisters Chardonnay, and they're my favorite producer in Oregon. I think the wines are outstanding. Even one of my producer friends came up to me, he was from Italy, he said, "Matt, have you tasted Lingua Franca? Like, how is that Chardonnay so pure?" So it's a good wine, but they're not on the official list. Let's get going. Okay, number one, bit of a mainstream wine, but I have to say I'm pretty impressed, was the Penfolds Grange 2019. This is not a cheap wine. I know it can run close to $1,000 based off Shiraz. Usually, I do like to poo-poo on this wine. However, the 2019, it just was showing just the perfect amount of development, enough black fruit and pepper flavors, yet it had those minerally and kind of gritty notes that I get in Bordeaux, especially from the Grave. It's expensive, but I thought it was showing super well. That's the reason why it's one of Australia's iconic wines. Next up was the Ridge 2004 Montebello, one of the iconic Cabernets in California, one of the iconic Bordeaux blends in the world. It was in the Judgment of Paris that Steven Spurrier put on. Montebello is a wine that I'm just never disappointed with. I always have super high expectations. The 2004 was still a baby. It reminded me, a couple weeks ago, I did a big Bordeaux tasting with my collectors where we drank a lot of old Bordeaux going back to 2000, and I was amazed how much the 2000s and 2004s are still a baby. This Ridge Montebello was still showing plenty of fruit, wasn't dried out, had a long way to go. The tannins were just so refined. I know it's also expensive, you know, short of $300, but it is an experience. It's a great wine. Next is a wine style I'm really getting into. In fact, I'm going back to the region in December for a masterclass and overview, is the Mastroberardino Stíléma Taurasi Riserva 2017, made of the grape Aglianico. I know it's the Barolo of the South, but tasting this next to a bunch of other Barolos, this did stand out. It was the only kind of unique Italian variety quality that was there besides Sangiovese and Nebbiolo. Mastroberardino's Radici Taurasi Riserva made the top 10 wine spectator list last year. But this wine, man, it's incredible. You have those tar flavors, a little bit of flower notes that you get in Barolos, but the fruit tends to be a little bit darker. In this wine specifically, the tannins were really refined, really round. They were grippy. Just a beautiful wine. There are a number of aged Barolos and Barbarescos being poured, and the finest one for me was the Bruno Giacosa Rabja Barbaresco 2016. This is a single vineyard wine. Rabja is a very well-known cru in Barbaresco. 2016 is such an outstanding vintage in Piemonte, all of Italy, all of Europe for that matter. But something is magical about the 2016 Barolos and Barbarescos. I loved tasting them when they were young because they were ready to drink right away. And by the taste of this, man, these can go the distance. It still had not shown any tertiary notes. It was still just rose petal, tar, flowers, sour cherry, cranberry fruit for days. This is not a cheap wine, but you know what? It's a heck of a bottle. Next up is a wine that's not usually in my wheelhouse. This is the Elion Rera Del Duero 2020. Vegas Sicilia was pouring their Unico 2014 next to their Elion, their Rera Del Duero. Rera Del Duero sometimes can be a bit too heavy for me, too oaky. This one, though, it was plenty of ripe fruit. I mean, you're definitely going to want the fruit if you want Rera Del Duero, but my goodness, the tannins were just incredibly silky. It was round. It had lots of texture. It wasn't too much for Rera Del Duero, a big wine. It was pretty balanced. I've had this wine in the past. It's been okay, but I have to say, the 2000, it was really good. Château Cheval Blanc, one of my favorite Bordeaux's in the world, was being poured, but the Saint-Émilion that impressed me the most was the Château Bélair Monange. I know this wine's also $250. Everything that I want about Saint-Émilion. You want the pencil lead, you want the dark cherry, you want the graphite-y type notes. And then Saint-Émilion has this kind of mineralness, maybe even the slight tinge of greenness that I really like. This is a wonderful wine. Here's the problem with tasting all these wines too. Every wine at the show was great, so the best of the best really stood out. I mean, for a wine to be really impressive, to stand out amongst all those great wines really says something, and this was. I know a lot of these wines are pricey, but it is what it is with wine now these days. Next up, an American Pinot Noir, the Calling Single Vineyard Series, Terra de Promissio. This wine is a joint ventureship with Jim Nantz, one of the legendary sportscasters in America. However, it's not all smoke and mirrors. This is serious Pinot Noir. Sometimes Sonoma Pinot Noir can be too ripe, too rich for me, but this was beautiful. It had the California fruit, but it had the earthiness. And the thing, sometimes Pinot Noir can be silky up front and then the fruit can fall off and it just can be a spine of acidity. This was balanced the whole way through. I don't know what this retails at. I know some of the Calling basic wines are pretty affordable. My only regret was as I missed Jim Nantz when I got to the booth. They said, oh my gosh, he just left 5 minutes ago. I don't like to take pictures with a lot of people, a lot of celebrities, not my thing, but I did want to take a picture with Jim Nantz. Maybe next time. Next up is one of the cheaper wines at the show, the Loveblock Central Otago Pinot Noir 2021. This retails for about $30. And why I was so impressed with this wine, I think it was the second or the third most inexpensive wine at the show. And for it to stand up against all these great wines really says something. You want pure Pinot Noir flavors. New Zealand, that's what you're going to get. You're going to get some cherry, some raspberry flavors. You get a touch of earthiness, maybe not as much as you're going to get sometimes in Oregon, Cote de Nui, Santa Barbara County. However, there's just a funness to it. And with the way that Pinot Noir is going at $30, this is really affordable, especially Central Otago, which is a hot area, and those Pinot Noirs can command a lot higher prices. Another Kiwi wine was the Grewacke Wild Sauvignon 2021. This is not your typical New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. This is barrel fermented with wild yeast. Had a little bit of cloudiness, a little bit of texture. It was Sauvignon Blanc, but it didn't have all those obnoxious explosive notes that some people get turned off about New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. It really almost reminded me of a cross between something from Friuli and then also Stoltman in Santa Barbara County makes an unfiltered Sauvignon Blanc that has cloudiness. It just has a little more texture, a little bit laziness. You can sense that's unmistakably Sauvignon Blanc. And at $25, This is New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc for wine geeks. That's the best way I can put it. Another Sonoma Pinot Noir. This was in Wine Spectator's top 10 wines of last year. The Rain Pinot Noir. 2022, this comes in around 80 bucks. Again, not cheap. Carlo Mondavi is the owner, the grandson of the late, great Robert Mondavi. The reason I was so impressed with this wine, again, Sonoma Pinot Noir sometimes can just be too ripe, too rich for me. This had all the earthiness and texture of Côte de Nuit with the California, the Sonoma fruit, drinkable right away. It's expensive, 80 bucks. You know, for great Pinot Noir, I feel like that's today's market. You know I love Sangiovese, and there were plenty. Brunello, Chianti Classico, even Bosco, my favorite Vino Nobile producer. But my favorite Sangiovese was the Valdicava Madonna del Piano, 2004 Brunello de Montalcino Riserva. Here's a hot take. I usually like to drink Brunellos on the younger side, especially because they need to be aged quite a bit before they're released. Sometimes I find, you know, Brunello is supposed to be a wine that you're really supposed to keep for a long time. Sometimes I find the fruit can dry off and I want that pretty sour cherry flavors. This had that still. It was still incredibly youthful. 2004. Lots of sour cherry, tobacco notes, still have that mineral and earthy grittiness. And the tannins, Brunello's tannins can be pretty aggressive. Were softened. Not a cheap wine, 180 bucks. But for me, a lot more impressive and memorable than the Valdicava basic Brunello de Montalcino. There were a number of iconic Napa wines being poured, like Dominus, Opus One, cult wines like La Coya. However, I have to say this about Napa Cabernet. When I started tasting through the Napa Cabernets, I wasn't really enthused because some of them were young, new releases. Napa Cab, it's not my favorite category, although I know the wines can be great, but they're just so expensive. And when they're young, I feel like they just kind of taste the same. They're just quite homogenous. But my next wine, the Mayacamas 2019. Mayacamas, along with the Heights, Martha's Vineyard, are cabs from Napa that I feel like have character right out the bat. This thing was loaded with sage and tobacco notes, along with those rich dark fruit flavors that people really love about Napa Cabernet. Tannins were refined. This was ready to go right away. Mayacamas has climbed in price. It's like doubled in the last, 10 years, but it's a Napa Cab that I still go to, I still love. Next was a surprise, the Domaine de la Vosgeraie.
Here we are, Clos de Vougeot Blanc. Oh, ooh la la, Domaine de la Vosgeraie. It's awesome.
The Le Clos Blanc de Vougeot 2018, a Vougeot Premier Cru. When you think of Clos Vougeot, you think of red wines. Next to Château de la Clos de Vougeot, right around the corner is this little vineyard that it's a tiny vineyard. It's only 3 hectares that has all white grapes dedicated to Chardonnay. It was a surprise for me. This is a rich barrel fermented white Burgundy, has all the minerals, slaty notes, but really what separates white Burgundy is texture. I think that they only bottled this in magnums. Maybe, I'm not sure. It's a monopole. They own the entire vineyard, so it's not cheap. The wine, I think it's 250 bucks. That's the way that Burgundy is going. But man, it was really impressive. And cool because it was a super big surprise. Everybody at the show was like, I didn't even know that there were whites in Vougeot. Believe it or not, I have a couple Canadian wines on here. One is the Checkmate Artisanal Winery. It's from the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia near Vancouver. This was the Queen Taken Chardonnay 2020 barrel fermented. This was a dead ringer for outstanding Sonoma or even Santa Barbara barrel fermented Chardonnay. Had so many rich pineapple, white peach flavors. Had the sandy texture I want from the barrel, a little bit of the yogurt notes, super long finish. I was supposed to go to the Okanagan Valley before COVID shut everything down. I do want to get out there. This was super interesting to me. I don't know the price. I'm guessing it's pretty expensive, but man, I was really impressed. Really impressed. Only thing I didn't like, it was in a Bordeaux bottle, not a Burgundy bottle. There were only 2 Rieslings at the show, and they both made my list. First was the Trimbach Frederick Emile 2017 Riesling. Trimbach is responsible for making the Clos Saint-Émilion in Alsace, one of the legendary Rieslings and legendary wines in the world. However, Frederick Emile comes in around 80, 90 bucks, and man, I always, Germany for me is the mecca when it comes to Riesling, but there's something about Alsatian Riesling that is distinctively different. It's a little bit richer. The aromas aren't as explosive, I don't think, but they just work well with that bigger body Riesling style, and this with a touch of age I thought was absolutely beautiful. Funny thing is I went up to the stand, I was like, do you have any Clos Saint-Émilion under the table there? Didn't have it, unfortunately. Next is the Bergstrom 2022 Bergstrom Vineyard Pinot Noir from Oregon. Bergstrom was actually one of the first Oregon Pinot Noirs I ever had. That and Cristal were the first 2 I ever had. The reason why this was so impressive is earlier in the day, I went to a portfolio tasting at Vineyard Brands, an importer, and they had some amazing wines out. Like, they had a Salon Le Menil 2013, a Delamont 2000 Champagne, had a couple of Burgundies open, and one of them was a 2019 Clos de Lembray, which is $500-600 red Burgundy, exceptional wine. When I went back and I tasted that Bergstrom, it really had some of those similar aromas that us wine geeks go gaga over when it comes to red Burgundy, the leather type notes, the fruit flavor in great red Burgundy. That is it red raspberry? Is it red plum? Does it move over to cherry? Does it sometimes move over to black raspberry? It's just a really distinctive flavor. The texture was there. I thought this was an outstanding wine. This is a very good producer. I don't know, they have a lot of vineyard designates. I'm guessing this wine is probably $100 plus, but I thought it was a heck of a wine. In Oregon, I think everybody's trying to chase and make a red Burgundy style of wine when they just make an Oregon style. However, there are a handful of producers that I believe really make true Burgundian red wines, and Bergstrom is one of them. There are a lot of champagnes present, a lot of great champagnes present, but a Franciacorta really impressed me. This is the Cal del Bosco Anna Maria Clementi 2014, Chardonnay, Pinot Bianco, and Pinot Noir. And the reason why this was so impressive is Franciacorta I have a problem with because the prices are pretty ridiculous. Sometimes I just think, why I'll just buy champagne instead of Franciacorta. I like an Italy Trento DOC a lot more because the value for money is outstanding. However, I have to say, this showed super well. Next to other great champagnes, 130 bucks is a special edition. It's not cheap. It's something that opened my eyes. It was the first time in my life that I had a Franciacorta that was like, okay, I get what they're trying to do, I get what they're trying to achieve, and I'm really impressed. Two sweet wines coming up the rear, the Inniskillin ice wine from Canada, from Niagara 2021. This was awesome. This was so good. I tasted it 3 times, and on the last day I went back and had a full glass. Ice wine sometimes can just be too cloying, too fat, just too rich in flavor, especially when young. They taste better as they age and develop. This was only 3 to 4 years old, but man, already rounded. It was showing some nuance already, but just the rich flavors. And Riesling with ice wine is so incredible because the spine of acidity it almost washes your palate clean, almost makes it like a dry wine. In Germany, a lot of Europe, ice wines are becoming rare. You don't make them every single vintage. However, Niagara and Canada, they're making them almost every single vintage. In the last year, I've tasted some excellent ice wines from Canada. I can see why it's a thing. Ice wines are not cheap, but man, they are something worth seeking out, worth trying if you're a wine lover. And the last one was the Quinta do Noval 2021 Vintage Port. I'm fairly young in the wine industry. I've been working in the industry for 10 years. I don't remember decades ago when you could not drink vintage port young. Now I really actually enjoy vintage port. The spirits are good. They've learned a way to soften and refine the tannins. And vintage port, man, it just doesn't age. You know, I drink vintage ports from the 50s, 60s, 70s before, and for me, they still taste young, still taste like the same. So I'm like, oh, why not taste the vintage upon release? I was tasting a lot of ports next to each other. This is the one that stood out with this rich concentration of flavors. Port, you got to have the right balance. The alcohol is high, it's 20%. You have the fruit flavors, and then you have to have that spine of acidity that's not too much, but not making the wine too fat. Quinta do Noval has it. They're always famous for vintage port. I thought this was outstanding wine. So those were my favorite wines for the show. Did you attend the Wine Spectator experience? Have you attended in the past? Have you tried any of these wines, these producers? I'd love to hear. Drop it in the comments below.